All right, gang. As promised yesterday, coming at you with the next video for this week's readings on neo-sophistic rhetorics and the first wave, I guess, of contemporary rhetorical theory, which, as I talked about with regard to the Palakos piece, is characterized by the Gorgianic model. And so all of the theory that we're going to encounter moving forward here is what I'm calling neo-sophistic, right? So if you have a good handle on, first of all, Gorgias and the encomium of Helen and that model, and if you have a good handle on Palakos, the better handle you have on this stuff, the better things are moving forward, I think. So the next piece we want to talk about here is a very famous essay, contemporary piece. It's one of, I guess you could call this kind of the very early stages of what we now would call contemporary. I got to look up the citation information. I'm pretty sure this was published in like the 50s. I want to say 58, 56, something like that. So it's a little bit older, and it's older than the Palakos piece, but they're very similar. Okay, so what we're talking about here, viewing rhetoric as epistemic, again, this question of knowledge, this question of how we know, the nature of knowledge, the nature of our, the process of inquiry, of coming up with decisions and coming up with our truths, right? So the point that Scott is making in this piece here is that rhetoric is not Platonic in the way that we've looked at with these models. He's not necessarily saying anything new, but he was when he was saying it. Again, he was coming out of this 300-year-long modern tradition where logic, science, reason, Descartes, all that stuff reigned supreme. And Aristotelian rhetoric and Ciceronian rhetoric were gone, right? So this is the return of those traditions. So it was kind of like saying it new, even though it was kind of old. And the basic point he's making here, just like Palakos, is that rhetoric is contingent. It deals with contingencies. So knowledge can never be certain, especially when we're dealing with questions of common matters, social issues, right? We almost never have absolute certain knowledge on anything we're talking about. So then we got to kind of get used to the fact of contingency and the fact of limited knowledge, partial knowledge, changing knowledge, changing circumstances, changing facts, and so on. So that's what he's getting after here. And I'll just kind of hit some of his main points. He starts off by distancing, himself from this modernist tradition of certainty. Now, with Plato, certainty takes the form of like metaphysical certainty, this idea that there's truth sort of that pre-exists the world, and it's this sort of cosmic, weird, other realm of true ideas, and it's trippy and weird, and that's not what he's getting at so much as that modern version of certainty, logic, science, reason, math, geometry. So it's sort of more like a worldly certainty. That's what the moderns, when I say moderns, again, I'm meaning like 17th through early 20th century. So now we're shifting away from that, more recent history. So he's distancing himself from that idea that what we do when we engage in matters of public debate is argue from true premises. So he says here, sorry, I need to put my glasses on. By the way, I'm at home today. I have a sick 10-year-old with a bad throat. So that's why I'm on my couch here today. He says at the top of 132, he says, "Were all men able, as some men are, to reason soundly from true premises, then rhetoric would be superfluous." So true meaning like certain, right? And when we're talking about issues like, whatever, gun control, abortion, environmental, realities, or you pick it, right? When are we proceeding from certain premises that we all agree are certain? That's sort of the point, is that we don't share certain premises, right? So that's the point of rhetoric, is to kick in when certainty is not available, when we must proceed and we must reason with one another in situations of uncertainty or partiality or newness or freshness or confusion or whatever, right? That's the world that rhetoric inhabits that he's arguing for here. So he's shifting away from this tradition that wants to embrace certainty. And what he's going to embrace instead, of course, then, is the realm of the probable. That's the Aristotelian realm. So there's a kind of throwback to Aristotle, even though he's not talking about Aristotle directly. As we'll see, he gets into Gorgias and this idea of contingency, which we talked about with Polakos, right? So on the bottom of 132 there, he says, Plato's Socrates confronted Gorgias with a choice, da-da-da-da. The question here is about knowledge, right? So that's the epistemic question. What kind of knowledge is rhetoric involved in? And if it's not involved in certain knowledge, then, what are we left with and how do we think about that? Now, the way he gets at this, on the top of 133, he's going through the work of Stephen Toulmin, which we've looked at briefly in last week's material, although we were more focused on Perelman there. But Toulmin, like Perelman, is a neo-Aristotelian, and he was really interested in this business of informal reasoning, which is reasoning that we engage in non-formal kind of contexts, and frankly, even informal contexts like law. We reason informally in the sense that we're operating from premises that might not be agreed upon, that might not be, known to be certain or true or valid in an unquestioning way, right? So he's contrasting two types of argument. One is analytic and the other is substantial or substantive. Analytic arguments, this is going through Toulmin, are those that are formal. We can analyze arguments formally if we think of them as just these sort of geometrical shapes, right? So, let's just come up with a formal argument. All, just out of the blue here, like all candles are evil. I just saw some candles. All candles are evil. Bob is a candle. Bob is evil, right? It follows the formal contours of a true, valid conclusion. All this, that is one of these, therefore that, right? So it works. It's valid. The problem is it's not true. It doesn't make any sense. That's an analytic type argument is one where we look at the formal dimensions. We don't look at the actual kind of substantive truth value of those assertions, right? So let's look at the substance. And when we look at substance, now we're in the realm of uncertainty because, very few things are absolutely one thing or another thing. Sort of think about columns here, right? So we've got analytic arguments that promote certainty, the search for certainty, and now we've got substantive arguments that promote contingency and probabilities, right? That's where rhetoric resides for Scott here. And the question of time, as we saw with Polakos, is important here. So again, analytic arguments are outside of time. They're formal. They're universal. They're always true, regardless of circumstances, regardless of situation, always. Whereas substantive arguments exist in time. And as he says toward the end there, like we're creating truth moment to moment, right? Things change constantly. So rhetoric exists in time. And time is always moving and changing, and circumstances are moving and changing. So probabilistic, substantive arguments are those that exist in time, in particular situations, and are therefore contingent. All right. So he says on 134, by truth, one may mean some set of generally accepted social norms, experience, or even matters of faith as reference points in working out the contingencies in which men find themselves. So there you go. This is where he's connecting pretty closely to the Polakos essay on this idea of time and contingency and knowledge as always kind of changing and evolving. And rhetoric is always in the mix of this dynamic, transformation. Take your pick of any kind of social issue, look back 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, whether it's, gay rights, whether it's gender issues, whether it's, children and adults, teachers, students, whatever. It's always, everything's change. Contingency. Things change because circumstances change. So therefore, rhetoric's job changes, or what its role changes. So that's how he's thinking about truth, which takes us right back to Aristotle, takes us right back to Gorgias, right? When we talked about nomos as social truth, agreed upon truth, that's sort of what we're talking about here. Now, next he talks about on 135 this idea of cooperative critical inquiry. So now, what is rhetoric up to? Rhetoric is involved in debate, struggle, conflict, disagreement, the process of trying to come up with decisions over uncertain matters, right? So this is where he really wants to sort of spend his time thinking about what rhetoric's up to and how it can service this. So he says, 135, debate as cooperative and critical inquiry. When so taken, it calls for a commitment to a standard, right? So if we accept that rhetoric's involved in debate and this idea of cooperative critical inquiry, right? It's like we are engaging in tough exchanges, we are engaging in tough arguments, but it's cooperative because we ultimately, hopefully, want the best possible solution. That's a like open question, I feel like, these days. Are we interested in cooperation anymore? Or is it more about just sort of the winning? That's a question we can leave out later. But, when he was writing, this is still a time, back in the 50s, around that time where there was still a lot of stuff being written about this, what we call the liberal tradition of deliberation and, using our civic-minded values and skills to engage one another, even if it's sort of messy and ugly and whatever, but we have our sort of mutual best interests in mind. And so we want the best possible decisions, right? So that's deliberation, that's cooperative critical inquiry. And rhetoric's involved in that. So, but we still require a standard, right? That's the last part here. So the last thing that he gets into in this piece is this idea of a world of debate and contestation. So 136 is largely about the struggle over uncertain premises. We don't agree all the time. Even with those who we agree with, we don't all agree all the time. So uncertainty, dispute, disagreement, these are like the absolute ground of our social civic lives, and rhetoric's present in all of it, right? But that means that it's present in change, messiness, unruliness. So it would be useful to have a standard to help guide our way through this. Even if we don't have an absolute standard for knowledge, which we are rejecting, we're not interested in absolute knowledge claims. What we are interested in is the best possible arguments that we can make in a given situation. That's highly Aristotelian. So we end off then on 137, the fourth section, with these three ethical guidelines. So he says the point of view that holds that man cannot be certain but must act in the face of uncertainty to create situational truth entails three ethical guidelines: toleration, will, and responsibility. So instead of like epistemic guidelines for truth statements, he's giving us ethical guidelines for uncertain truth statements, right? We know that we're probably going to be wrong. We're probably going to err. So how can we best proceed with our cooperative and critical inquiry? Toleration, will, responsibility. Toleration is this idea of holding out for the best possible evidence, reasoning, and so on. To be tolerant, right? So he says, on the other hand, uncertainty, taking truth as a toehold to climb into the yet-to-be created rather than as a program to unfold regardless of the circumstances, demands toleration. Uncertainty demands toleration. That's a key insight, right? We need to be tolerant of other opinions that might be different from our own. We need to be tolerant to other sources of reason or appeal or whatever that we might not have encountered before. We got to kind of be open to accept. That's an ethical guideline, right? What goes with that then is will, right? So we wait, we listen, we absorb, we learn, we read, we talk, we take in as much as we can, but ultimately we do need to act, and that's where the will kicks in. So if one cannot be certain, then one must either withdraw from conflicts of life or find some way to act in the face of these conflicts. He must say with Gorgias, I know the irreconcilable conflicts, and yet I act, right? So we must act We must make decisions in the face of uncertainty. We do this all the time in democratic processes, right? Democracy is many wonderful things, but it's never certain. It's never 100% of anything. It's always compromise and half measures and incompleteness and so on. So we need the will to kind of dip our toe into the river, even though the river is constantly moving and we can never kind of get it right. We must act regardless. We must act with our best ethical foot forward, our best ethical possibilities, right? So there's will, but then responsibility is the last ethical guideline, right? One who acts without certainty, this is the bottom of 137, must embrace the responsibility for making his acts the best possible, right? So he must recognize the conflicts of the circumstances that he's in. These are good sort of mutually reinforcing ethical guidelines. First of all, do your ethical best to be open to truth as you may not understand it. Next, do your best to act with humility, with the best possible outcome in mind. And then, accept responsibility for the outcome. Things don't go perfect. Things don't always go well, But what comes with the will to act is the responsibility to accept uncertain outcomes, maybe even undesirable outcomes, right? So that's kind of it for Scott. It's a fairly quick, fairly simple essay, but good in terms of like setting up, the kind of assumptions about rhetorical theory that again they're gonna percolate through everything that we're going to be reading henceforth here. We're going to see another version of this with Black's second persona essay, which I'm going to do next. But yeah, so knowledge is uncertain. Rhetoric is involved in decision-making processes in the midst of uncertainty. But in order to do so, ideally, we should follow these ethical guidelines or these norms of cooperative critical inquiry. So that's Scott's very famous, very well-known essay, Rhetoric is Epistemic. Rhetoric is about knowledge, but just not certain knowledge. It's about probable and contingent knowledge. That's Aristotle and Gorgias. And so now how do we proceed from there? Hope that works. Hope that makes sense. And, once again, questions, come find me and we'll clear you up. If not, see you on Black Second Persona.